Sure. I mean, one of the things, just to bookmark here so I don't forget, is afterwards, I hope to remember to send you 2 blog posts that we did. You can follow on our blog. And one of them is called The Anatomy of a Grant. And it really talks about the kind of wild ride of moving through the Go Biz and CA Jobs grant process for the RI grant round 1, which is just about closed. And, in the spirit of like not biting the hand that feeds you and trying to also look at challenges and rolling out new innovative things that are hard, it's hard making something from nothing. We really wrote that blog in the spirit of collaboration and also looking towards improvement. And we had a follow-up article that really talked about the next step for us and what we went up to. So that captures a lot of our sort of experience in the flow of just like the grant process. But there's a couple things you said in your intro that we didn't record here. So for anyone listening or watching this later, there's a great intro that really talked about trying to look at how the state set up this process structurally and how that's kind of challenging for some cross-cutting projects. And I think it touches upon maybe even your work professionally in your life, which is, as we look at biodiversity and intersectionality being intimately twined, right? That we find that things aren't in silos in nature and they aren't in silos in the built environment. There's overlap between all of these things. And so by having a sector approach to jobs first really doesn't allow the innovation and the collaboration that it needs to occur across industry to support healthy communities and healthy ecosystems. And so from the get-go, the mindset is the old mindset, but has got us into some of these challenges in the first place, is perpetuated through the structural elements of the grant itself and how we've looked at innovation and funding. And that's not meant to be critical. It's just meant to say that we carry inertia into this process. And that inertia, as we're trying to improve systems and jobs and communities and biodiversity and carbon and all those things we need to work towards, are structurally at odds with how we built the grant process itself. And I've heard that not just from my team and the amazing coalition that we set up, but also from some of the other grant participants too, that they were hoping to really cross those chasms, but it wasn't built that way. And so I don't know if that speaks to you as you look at regenerative systems and dispelling the myth of externalities and economic models to say there is no such thing as somewhere else. It is always someone else. That harm, crosses the chasm. And so innovation and solutions must cross those chasms as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to start at a large esoteric level. I apologize.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's great. And I think what's nice about this process too is like the case studies it's people sharing their story, and it's the people doing the actual work, and they're coming with totally different perspectives, but I think ultimately sharing the same sentiment, but they describe it in a different way. Over all 8 that I've done so far. And I think that's incredible because then that's going to touch, the different people receiving it as well in 8 different ways. And that's kind of the whole point. So I think that's great. I love it. I agree with you completely, by the way.
Awesome. So that being said, the state, I think, was trying to bring in something they hadn't really done before, which is how do we bring in co-investors into these projects so that the state's money can go a little bit farther by bringing in opportunities that include more folks willing to put capital forward and reap the upside benefits of the things that we all are doing. Except structurally, the grant really centered nonprofits and community-based organizations in some cases who don't necessarily have a return on economic value. There's a return on impact if you're looking at equity or carbon or biodiversity and jobs and community growth and infrastructure, all those things. But sometimes there's not the ability to give back a financial return. And so I think the spirit of the state's approach to say, how do we bring in additional third-party investors was a good idea in terms of that intention, but how that works structurally is sometimes at odds with how those organizations are used to looking at investment. And so that is another just element to touch upon. That's okay.
Absolutely. No, that makes total sense. And yeah, I mean, that's most of the 250 plus projects that we've been looking through are definitely, their returns are based primarily on, the nonprofit structure and impact. So absolutely. Totally. Yeah.
Well, I've been going on and on. Do you want to ask some of your questions or do you want me to tell you about our project itself? Where do you want to go from there?
Yeah, I would love to hear about your project specifically, as well as when and in our time together that we talk about these bigger nature things doesn't really matter because I'll be able to structure it how we want to in the end anyways. So but I was basically what I've been doing is starting with like, tell us a story, like tell us your arc, like what was the gap in your community that, your project is initially trying to fill, like where are you at right now? And then what are your plans moving forward, which of course we have, that information written, but it's nice to hear your personal perspective on it. One thing that I don't know how much this will apply actually to your project, but just that I say it, we've been trying to use some 1757 language just to like kind of ding, ding, ding in some people's ears. So that has been talking about land cover type. So like croplands would probably be relevant with, biochar and that type of thing. So we have land cover type, essentially forest, shrubland, grassland, cropland, developed land. So probably would be more in that cropland developed land space. Because developed lands also talks about some more urban work.
Sure.
But yeah, we can start from that.
Yeah. I mean, so what might be helpful then is if I actually share a screen. I don't have a presentation prepared for you today, but I do have this kind of 2-page infographic that might help steer how I talk about our project in general. You might find me share it later on that I can share with you.
And absolutely. And you can also always send me photos or videos and things like that after that I can overlay with our conversation. That's what I've been having people do as well, if that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go ahead and get this to a visible spot where you can see it better on the screen. And again, this is just kind of a big, messy infographic that's meant to sort of encapsulate the entire project overall. Oops, I have to ask to share the screen.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to zoom way out for a second. You won't be able to see all the things here, but again, this is a large 2-page infographic that encapsulates an entirety of our project here. And I'm going to be walking through both page 1 and page 2 a little bit. I'm going to zoom in so you can actually read the things. But this was really meant to tell the entire story all at once. And part of this was actually facilitated because in the grant process, we ended up with a pitch competition at the end that felt a little bit more like Silicon Valley Sandhill Road than a grant out of the governor's office. But nonetheless, we rolled with those punches and figured out how to fit our 160-page grant into a 8-slide, 5-minute pitch. And then we found that we needed to have takeaways for people. So we've shrunk that down even further into a 2-page, 19-inch long infographic that's meant to really talk about the overall arc of what we're doing. And so we are a workforce development center, the REAP Climate Center, and our regional collaboration team. And then we ended up with a cross-regional sector lead, it was called, in the grant process of University of California Ag and Natural Resources. We were really proud to be doing work with them. It was kind of a bumpy process to find who was going to be that partner, but it had ended up being a really good idea, and we were sort of happy to really, it would have made us better. But ultimately, we are trying to give the tools and trades to communities to grow the industries that solve its problems. So we are looking at it through a job creation and a workforce development perspective. And so again, with the REAP Climate Center and the overall project for us, and this ended up a little bit different in our grant at the very end, but we, are seeking $4.5 million for a $12 million project that returns $50 million in economic value and jobs over a 5-year period. The reason there's a difference between the 4.5 and the 12 is we've got some additional funding sources as well as pro bono services, and then some debt financing built in there. And while University of California Ag and Natural Resources sits above us overall, we are sitting with sub-awardees, so our coalition partners within our region of the College of Alameda, Alameda County Workforce Board, Greenbelt Alliance, Alameda Chamber of Commerce, and then Finney and Makepeace of Get the Vista Brown. And then, there's a lot of focus in our area, in our sector of ag tech. And the thing that we like to remind people is that technology is not always new, right? So let's acknowledge ancient indigenous practices, regenerative systems, biomimicry-based systems that embrace, healthy processes for the earth that have been tested over millennia. That is technology. And so if we are spending money to fund the technology, let's leave room in that conversation for these systems and practices to also be acknowledged as technology and fund them as such. And so that's one of the things we're really trying to do is say, we like to Center Regenerative Systems as AgTech for Jobs, Innovation, and Business Building Support. What you probably see in the work that you do, Paulina, is you probably notice we're crossing a chasm in that, right? We're trying to take this horizontal work that happens across the land, your feet in the soil, your hands in the bay. You're actually doing the work of cover crops. You're doing the work of regenerative practices. We call that horizontal work because it starts at a community level and it goes across the horizon. It actually is physical biodiversity work with the earth, and it's where carbon value originates. But what we're trying to do is fit that into a larger system that we call vertical integration, which fits into economic models, into carbon markets, into all sorts of policy and jobs. And we're trying to connect those two through community ties. It's pretty heady, but we're doing it. Ultimately, our project overall has 3 phases, and we would like to, the way that economic flag sometimes is say it's a 13x return on investment. But it's really based in 3 main things. One is the purchasing of our campus and the adjacent building. And that's also because we serve communities from a resilience capacity standpoint, but also from a job training and development capacity standpoint. And place-based security is super important for the vulnerable communities that we serve. And so we have to know that we're going to be around to continue to serve them. Also, accredited regenerative job certificate training. So get people trained on the skills to do this work. We call that a jobs layer. And so a lot of the grant that we're focused on here is focused on food systems and on ag production. But there's some overlap into nature-based solutions for infrastructure. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. And then ultimately, job creation is super important to the state. It's also super important to the economic models to which we are currently tied. And so we think that it's important to get people jobs, but we also want to train people to build businesses and services on top of those jobs, on top of those disciplines. And there's just one little anecdote I can give you that I think was super important to anchor in this work that we do as we serve vulnerable communities, which is as some of this work was tied to climate change mitigation, we know that the communities who are currently and will continue to be hardest hit are the most vulnerable among us. And so it's super important to get jobs in those communities to help solve these problems, because then they have a voice at the table for how that community is being shaped. But what that means sometimes is those communities are now improved to a point that they're at greater risk for gentrification. And so if we don't look at also developing business building support and wealth building support on top of those jobs, they're at a future risk for that next thing that's coming down the pipe. And so we want to make sure that that jobs layer and that business building support really fit together. So we're looking at what's the next thing we might have unintended consequence from the work that we're doing. And so we think that's why it's really important to have job training and business building support. And so at the end of this project, what we're going to have is physical assets. And we think that's super important, that we can turn 4.5 million into a long-term 8.5 million in durable assets that we can continue beyond this grant phase to do training and business building support. But the things that we're focusing on here, and I think you might notice what they are on the right side, we call them accreditation assets and job pathways, right? I mean, we're trying to marry languages of disparate systems. But ultimately, these things, biochar, fungal-based bioremediation, vermiculture, compost, urban farming, polyo practices, fermentation certificates, hydrology and transpiration, and then regenerative landscaping in general. We think those are the building blocks of life on Earth. We think that it's probably important to maybe get people trained up in how to manage those systems and then how to build businesses on top of them. Full stop, So I've covered a lot in a little bit. I hope that's okay. But why don't I take a breath, maybe a little sip of water, and see if you have questions so far.
I'm just kind of in awe. I think you were able to verbalize so much of what I would take a very long time to describe, and how nuanced your approach is and how thoughtful it is for longevity. And yeah, I just think it's remarkable, honestly, the way you're bringing up these agricultural topics, but how it fits in a community long term. It's it's really comprehensive, and it's really caring of the space that it's supposed to be in. So I'm very excited to share this and hear more as well. Yeah.
But this is the life's work of myself and many people, right? So this is all kind of coming together. I think the one thing's really interesting is we talked earlier about the state trying to have a unique, innovative approach to how do they bring in co-investment. And I think that they're sniffing around the right thing and they're kind of getting there, but the folks who are making some of the decisions at a high level around how do we build jobs for within ag tech for food systems and biodiversity, they're not native to the language of a regenerative process and to equity-driven systems. But I know that they're trying to find a way to say, hey, how do we stretch our dollars out to do more good? I think it's coming from a really good, well-intentioned place. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, though hard to quantify, is intersectionality. And that is, of course, social, racial, environmental justice all being part of the same conversation. And the big news is that if you do it thoughtfully with intention, and I mean like really hard work, you can spend the same dollar 3 times, right? You can really stretch that out across different levels of impact. And so, again, I'm talking about biodiversity impact, I'm talking carbon impact, I'm talking food health systems within communities. And so these things are super important from a structural perspective of how do we make our state stronger and better and more durable. But that's how we're approaching that. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in this next little part, but it really matters to us, right? Which is how are we financing this thing? Again, we're a nonprofit. We've been around 4.5 years. We are super excited to have had 6,000 people come, 6,500 now, people come through our doors to help build this space that we have with found and upcycled materials from communities that are discarding things. And again, we have infrastructure. We have a maker space here. We have regenerative labs and exhibits for all of these things. And again, it's all from bringing community together to do the thing. So we're trying to walk that talk just structurally. So we're really good at like stretching dollars out because that's what has to happen. And so in this grant, we are doing a number of things. I hit those high notes up above. But ultimately, when we really look at the work that's being done, it's in the center section here, which is, the actual training of folks. But let me roll back up a little bit more and tell you, and I had them on the screen for a while, but ultimately, the yield of our project, in addition to the 5.6 acres of land and regenerative labs and exhibits and the co-working spaces for the AgTech Accelerator, all of those things, we are ultimately training 460 people. Now, I don't know why I put the 12 in the middle there, but that 460 is 360 entry-level jobs. I realized I missed a 5 over here. And then 205 high-road jobs. And so those are 2 different pathways for people doing work in this space, but it really shows that we're trying to get folks trained up and give individuals accredited certificates. And some of the folks that we serve, Justice Impacted Youth, for example, maybe have never had a certificate or anything that actually built them up that became something that could transfer them into other jobs, right? And empowered workers is a worker who can transfer places. And then the 12 startups that we'd be launching, and ultimately providing funding for both people doing the training through stipends. And that's for them to choose how they see fit, if they need it for transportation or childcare or other things, or just money in the pocket. And then non-dilutive funding for the startups, right? Traditional startup models in California and globally are that there's a pound of flesh that's taken early, and there's a lot that fail because of that. And so our hedge against that is to say, how do we give you early non-dilutive funding to get you off the ground as you're building these businesses? And then for us, we really look at this as community engagement. So we do have job pathways from a vocational perspective. How do you do the thing? But ultimately for us, that follows this arc of play and discovery all the way up to job training, right? Because there's curiosity that needs to be built in there. There's awareness for young folks that this is even a thing that they can do with their lives. And so we do a lot of workshops, engagement with volunteers. But also, and I don't know if you put this into the final, write-up or not, but I do like to mention that, and I don't give an exact number because I get argued with all the time, but the majority of biodiversity remaining on Earth today is in indigenous controlled lands. And so when you look at that, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, what is the process of knowing, right? How is that information passed down generationally? How is it taught through demonstration, example, and practice? And so we are fitting things into a very Western mindset of an accredited certificate training program, but we are trying to build in community elements of experience and play and discovery, because we don't actually know how these practices have been passed down or why it's working in some communities and not others. But if you zoom out and you look at biodiversity on Earth at a high level, there is other things built into the process of the dissemination of knowledge. And so for us, when we develop biochar and fungi and others, one thing we do on our campus, and again, I like to call a campus a half-mile long of be careful what you wish for, because we got the space and now we're trying to do all the things. But the thing we do is we invite a third-party organization in to be what we call our practice keeper. Our staff here and the collective of volunteers don't necessarily know how to do biochar well, right? It's very specific. And so once we've identified a job pathway and that job markets can support these workers coming into them, we give space on our campus often for free to a third-party organization to come and be our practice keeper. And we do that because we convert their business practice into a curriculum and do a job training pathway, right? But sometimes, almost always, it's an ancient indigenous practice or it's a biomimicry-based practice. And so our effort is once we identify the job pathway that can support this discipline, we try to anchor it in community and anchor it in the third-party organization that could benefit from being here. And so we're formalizing that endeavor that we've been doing for a while now through this grant by calling it an AgTech Accelerator, right? We've been doing that all along, right? It's just community-based collective of people coming together and sharing information. We're trying to fit it into a different model. So a lot to unpack in there, but does that make sense so far?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really wonderful, well explained story. I'd love to have this infographic as well. If that would be all right with you, I can add it like on its own in the story map, I'm thinking.
Sure. Well, is it okay if I keep going a little bit? I'm just at a ball.
Yeah.
So I'm on the other side of the infographic now. And the first side was really kind of about the numbers, about the metrics, about the economics of it all. But this is a little bit more about like, why are we doing what we're doing and where does it fit? And again, as you see, I'm trying to speak two different languages at one time. That's a lot of what this work is its translation layer, trying to fit these systems into an economic context and into a policy context that makes sense so that it's undeniable that these things actually pencil, right? I've got a bunch of funny certificates in my life. One of them is from the UC Berkeley Law School in sustainable capitalism for directors. I think I got the certificate partially just I wanted to be able to say that in meetings. It's such a funny phrase to put together. But it actually really makes sense. Like these systems do when you do the math all the way out, and especially into health outcomes, it pencils. It's crazy not to do these things. And so we're trying to contextualizing it. So we say we embrace nature's technology for an outsized ecological and economic return, right? That language that's meant to fit things together. So both approaches make sense. But we have an investment thesis. Again, we know that we live in an economic system. I think that I'm a harm reduction guy where there will be the built environment. Concrete does exist. And sometimes we can have nature-based solutions, right? Sometimes we're going to have concrete. But ultimately, we need the things that we're doing here to pencil within our larger economic context and statewide objective for jobs and growth and all those other things. So I don't want to sort of demonize those things. I want to find a way to tell this story within that context. And so for us, our investment thesis is that we can teach people the same tools, trades, tech, innovation to cross these chasms, right? And so if I say AgTech+BioSciences for food security and resilience, right, I'm talking about cover crop, I'm talking about agroforestry, I'm talking about silvopasture, I'm talking about regenerative food systems, I'm talking about increased microbial environments so you can get to food security through enhanced nutrition, right? I could dwell for one moment, but I'll touch on this real briefly, but I've got a TED Talk at MIT that talks about this, so you can go watch that some other time, humble flux. But the fun thing is, like, as you're building a soil sponge that has enhanced microbial environments, you can actually grow regenerative produce that has 10, 20, 50 times the nutritional value of non-regenerative produce. And so if you look at that ag output, you can get to food security through optimization, right? Let's speak the language of technology, speak the language of our states. That's a Silicon Valley word, right? But we can optimize our food systems in a way that has an outsized return. Well, one thing that's really cool, and that might be ag tech and biosciences for food security and resilience. But if you look on the other side of the screen here, that's also the same process, the nature-based infrastructure for climate change mitigation. As we look at sea level rise, we have to create soil sponges for resilience around our shorelines. So that soil sponge that can hold more water, that's the same soil sponge. They're technically, physically, the do A, B, C, and D before 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's the same process across both of these different paradigms. And so earlier we talked about how it's sometimes challenging to approach the state's grant through the perspective of silos. This is a perfect example. As we train workers up and we give them certificates that empower them and make them mobile to move into other jobs, other places, you can move between food systems into climate change mitigation work seamlessly. And so our 2-for-1 approach, and again, I like 2-for-1 deals, everyone does, I suppose, is that we can train people across these chasms. And so that's how we try to expand workforce and innovation with cross-sector training business support. So again, I see you sort of smiling. I think you get that inherently in the work that you probably do. And so, it's, again, we're trying to speak all of the languages here. So we look at job development and business building support through a very similar lens. I also know that the state looks at job development and job creation as 2 separate metrics. And we weren't really looking at that in our first approach here to the round 1 funding. So we're moving into round 2, and we're really going to draw the line and show where we're actually creating a job versus training people into existing job categories. We think it's very similar, but again, there's been some feedback from the first round that for the second round of this funding that we need to really pull those apart. But ultimately, we as an organization before this grant ever came along, we serve vulnerable population. So veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, special needs, and then ultimately disinvested communities, right? We think that's really important that brings up a region overall when you reinvest in disinvested communities. And we're doing that through nature-based job certificates because, again, and these are all kind of tag along, but we do think nature is infrastructure that can be proven, be measured, be quantified from a health safety perspective. We can help the client start with jobs. You can read all these on your own. From the business building side, we think that we have a unique approach. There's a couple ways that organizations end up on our campus. It's either through this forthcoming AgTech Accelerator or those on-campus partners, those experts, those practice keepers we talked about earlier. And again, we feel like this fits into the state's objective to build businesses. And again, I mentioned earlier, but we think that's also kind of that hedge against future gentrification in communities as if we build wealth and strength within those communities. And then ultimately, this is just the nuts and bolts of it, right? This is getting more into the economic side of these things, but climate risk is business risk. Climate change is an opportunity. Climate change mitigation is opportunity. And so as we talk about food systems and as we talk about biodiversity plans that are statewide, ultimately we're talking about the reduction of fossil fuel inputs. We're talking about the reduction of herbicides and other things that might be harmful to adjacent systems and food systems and waterways and kelp forests as it makes its way out to the coast and all of that stuff. And so ultimately we're trying to get people to build businesses on top of nature-based disciplines to keep the wealth in the communities, but also to have those outlying co-benefits you see within a regenerative context. So what are we doing? Like, what does this grant fund? It funds our process. And our process is to try to be a little more nimble and adaptive than, say, our community college partners. Don't get me wrong, we love our community college partners. But for them to roll out new curriculum to be responsive to climate, nature, food systems work, it takes 2 to 3 years. The way we do it through a vocational approach is by giving the ability to rapidly roll out new curriculum based on feedback from employers, based on trade organization needs, unions, and ultimately biodiversity and nature-based system work. So in our grant, what we do is, and we're doing this right now, we were also a grant winner in the Catalyst grant, which was the earlier phase before round 1 and round 2 of California Jobs First. So we were a Bay Area Jobs First Catalyst grantee award with Greenbelt Alliance. And so we're doing that right now for some of these sectors or these disciplines. So we do an energy sector analysis of a bunch of data work. I can send you one of those that we had almost done for biochar. And it shows how we're out there figuring out what are the jobs that exist today, what are the new jobs that can be created, what is the economic impact, how does that work for nature-based systems. We then get MOUs from employers, trade orgs, and unions to say that the jobs that the training that we are doing aligns with their needs, and we give them a voice in that training. We also try to get a commitment to at least interview or mock interview people that come out of our programs to say, hey, let's close that gap between education and employment. There's a big chasm, which sounds a lot like good luck. We want to actually reduce that and make it seem a little more tangible. We don't think that you should just be kicked out of an institution and then maybe find a way to make it. And so we try to close that gap. And there we go. And then ultimately we develop a regenerative curricula, and it's CARF accredited, it's Bureau of Post-Secondary Education accredited. And then the fun part for us is building out the physical labs and interactive exhibits on our campus. And again, remember I mentioned play and discovery up to training and job placement? Remember that from earlier? Then again, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of going on and on. Um, so for us, as I talked about, fungi-based bioremediation and the vermiculture as a job pathway, right? And biochar. For us, it starts with that play and discovery. So our labs and exhibits are all fun. So they're meant to be, it's a fungi hub, it's a biome boutique, it's a hydrology house, it's a microbe mine, it's a biochar bar. So like all of these things are meant to be playful. Think the Exploratorium in San Francisco, but for regenerative job training, you know? And so we get to build that out as part of this grant for each one of the disciplines. So I'm most nerdy excited about that. And then we do career pathway matching. So we don't just tell someone, hey, here's the class you're going to take. There's a little bit of discovery and interaction and survey work to say, like, is this a good fit for you? Do you want to do this work? And part of this, as we serve sometimes underserved communities, we are at a high level, we need more people working on biodiversity and climate than are interested in biodiversity and climate. There's just a disconnect between how many people we need physically on the task, right? And how many people are really intimately interested in that task. And so the way we think of solving that is through the vehicle of jobs. And a lot of the communities that we serve may or may not be inherently out of the gates interested in climate, and maybe they're more focused on other existential threats like racism and poverty. And so our thought is through a job pathway into biodiversity work, climate work, ag systems work, we kind of solve two problems: the existential crisis that communities may be facing over here. Well, we also get more people working on climate and biodiversity over here. So that's kind of why we do that career path matching. Ultimately, we give you the training for the certificate. And then we don't just say good luck. Sometimes it's nice to know how to be in employment. And so we have additional professional development and wraparound services about the DISC assessment, self-advocacy in the workplace, resume writing, interview training, job seeking support, and sometimes placement. So not just what's your certificate, but like, how do I be in employment? So we're trying to work on the whole person in this process. Then ultimately we do some follow-up once people are placed. And then everything that sits on top of that, 9 and 10 over here, is really that business building support through the AgTech Accelerator. And then ultimately, really, how do we harden this and make it equitable through non-dilutive seed funding, off-take agreements through network, right? If you're converting to regenerative practices and the work that you're doing in your business, the least we can do is help you find a place to offload that yield. And then ultimately impact partnerships. So it's intersectional and cross-discipline. All right. So that being said, we're third place. It's a thing that exists. You can come here and touch a thing. You can find community. We've got potlucks. We've got workshops. So we've got stuff going on. We're learning. We're learning as we go from each other. But ultimately, like if I want to zoom way out, we want to teach you how to build a thing, fix a thing, grow a thing. That's it. And if you can do that, you can get a job, you can build a business, you can build resilience, you can solve for biodiversity, you can solve for carbon. So, that's a little bit about what we're up to. We can use all the help we can get. And, we're handing off right now. So we're working on funding, and we were sad that no Bay Area projects were awarded in the round 1 funding of the RI grant. We worked real hard, but so did a lot of people. When I went to a pitch competition, I was such a fanboy. I was like, I want that project to win. I want that project to win. And so it turns out maybe I thought that too much because we didn't win. But we hope to in the next round. But also the neat thing about all of this is we ended up with a partnership that's durable with the University of California Ag and Natural Resources. And we're trudging on with them regardless of how this comes together for RI. Now, again, we really hope we win because we need this funding and we're kind of hanging on by a thread, to be totally frank and vulnerable with you. But we found we are so much better on the other side of this process because the state forced us to really organize our thoughts and really organize our process. And I might have gone a little overboard. We have a 982-line spreadsheet that maps out the 18,772 hours that will take to do this project across our coalition partners from a project management standpoint. So we're more ready than we've ever been. And it's because the state forced us into that mindset. So while I'm, a little bit upset that we didn't win, we are now actually probably able to do it in a way that we weren't before the California Jobs First structure came along. So it's weird. I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but it's, it's the process.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great positive, thing to point out. I think that I've heard that from other people too. It's like serving some sort of structure that can be like, okay, this is like, yeah, down to the hour. I mean, that's pretty remarkable to have that sorted out to that. And I'm glad, yeah, UCANR, that's a wonderful, obviously, partner to have. They're doing great work. So many friends. Wow.
I didn't realize I've never told this whole story all at once before.
It sounds like you've told it like a million times, honestly. Like the way you were able to, like, that's a good particular talk, I think, for sharing story. That was really wonderful and will be very easy for me to edit and put into one piece because it's so robust on its own. Yeah, I mean, if there's anything else you want to share, you touched all my questions plus. So I'm very satisfied and happy and just, yeah, I'm so thrilled that this work is being done like near and dear to me in so many ways. I couldn't resonate more with everything you shared. And yeah, I just it's with everything going on in the world, it makes me so grateful that people are doing work like this in my house.